false confession experts, they only tell you part of the story. In a recent article entitled Law Enforcement Experts on Why Police Shouldn't Be Allowed to Lie to Suspects, Professor Saul Kassan describes a series of cases in which he suggests that innocent people confess to committing serious crimes because the police lied to them about incriminating evidence. Such misrepresentations as: we have surveillance footage of you that night, your shoe prints were at the crime scene, cell phone records prove that you were there, your DNA was on the victim, and your friend said she wasn't with you like you said. So the first question to ask is, can the investigator legally misrepresent evidence to the suspect? And the answer is yes. In 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Frazier versus Cupp, concluded that while misrepresentations of evidence were relevant, they did not make an otherwise voluntary confession inadmissible. The court judged the materiality of the misrepresentation by viewing the totality of circumstances. In this particular case, Frazier had been falsely told that his accomplice confessed. So in other words, if police did not engage in any coercive behavior, threats of harm, physical abuse, promises of leniency, denial of rights, etc., misrepresenting evidence in and of itself is not likely to cause an innocent person to confess. In the Kassan article, he conveniently fails to mention that in all of the cases he's referencing, the investigators engaged in threats, promises of leniency, denial of rights, excessively long interrogations, or other coercive behaviors. So it isn't the misrepresentation of evidence that is the trigger for any kind of false statement, but the investigator's use of coercion or abusive tactics that is the genesis for a false confession. Consider the court's opinion in U.S. v. Graham, in which the court pointed out that misrepresenting evidence is one factor to consider among the totality of circumstances in determining voluntariness. And the court acknowledges that there are a number of cases in which statements elicited from a defendant in response to police deception were found involuntary. But the court noted that in every one of those cases there were aggravating circumstances not present in their particular case. Such circumstances as subjecting the accused to an excessively long interrogation, the application of physical force or the threat to do so, the making of a promise to induce the confession. So again, in other words, it is not the misrepresentation of evidence that is the genesis of a coerced or even false confession, but the aggravating circumstances present during the interrogation. Deborah Davis and Richard Leo, who are very vocal law enforcement interrogation critics, have acknowledged that, quote, many, and perhaps most, of the interrogations in the DNA exoneration cases, several of which included misrepresenting evidence of the subject, crossed the line of proper interrogation techniques through the use of explicit threats and promises, feeding suspects crime facts, and or other coercive practices. Here is the reference to the article that makes that statement. In another report, after reviewing 110 DNA exoneration cases, People have reported that this study failed to find a single false confession of a cognitively normal individual that did not include the use of coercive tactics by the investigator. The author identified coercive interrogation tactics as the use of physical force, denial of food, sleep, or the bathroom, explicit threats of punishment, explicit promises of leniency, and extremely lengthy interrogations. Here is the report that includes that information. We have never, in our written materials or training programs, advocated that the investigator lie to the subject about incriminating evidence during the investigative interview. In fact, during the interview, the investigator should be a neutral, objective, non-judgmental fact finder, developing the subject's story, their alibi, their relationship to the victim, the who, what, when, where, why of the issue under investigation. Now, as for misrepresenting evidence during the interrogation, Our position is that introducing fictitious evidence during an interrogation presents a significant risk that the guilty suspect may detect the investigator's bluff, resulting in a significant loss of credibility and sincerity. For this reason, we recommended if this is going to be done, it should be a last resort tactic. We recommend that misrepresenting evidence should not be used when questioning a suspect who acknowledges that they may have committed the crime, even though they have no specific memory or recollection of doing so. And we also recommend that misrepresenting evidence should not be done, should be avoided when interrogating a youthful suspect with low social maturity or a suspect with diminished mental capacity. In fact, several states have enacted legislation that prohibits investigators from misrepresenting evidence to individuals under the age of 17 or 18. Now, in addition to using these kind of anecdotal cases, Casson, Leo, Davis, and other law enforcement interrogation critics oftentimes refer to research that supports the premise that misrepresentations of evidence in and of itself causes false confessions. And there are two primary studies they describe. One of the studies that they reference to support their claim that misrepresenting evidence will cause an innocent person to confess is referred to as the Alt Key study. In this study, students were asked to perform a data entry project and cautioned not to hit the Alt key because if they do, it will cause the computer to crash. However, unbeknownst to the students, while they were entering the data, the researchers forced the system to crash and then falsely accused the students of hitting the Alt key. And in some instances, confronted them with a witness who reported seeing them do so. Under these circumstances, a number of students signed written confessions despite their innocence. A second study that social psychologists often use to support their thesis that misrepresenting evidence causes false confessions is one in which students were given a set of assignments and told that in some assignments they could collaborate with their classmates, but in other assignments they could not. The researchers later accused the innocent subjects of improperly collaborating with certain assignments, informed them that they had violated university rules prohibiting cheating, and for some minimized the extent of their wrongdoing and encouraged them to take responsibility for their actions. Half of the students were told there was a hidden video camera in the room which would eventually reveal their guilt or innocence. Under this circumstance, 93% of the guilty suspects confessed and 50% of the innocent suspects confessed. However, when you pull the curtain back and look at the details of the research, as it turned out, these innocent participants did not confess to helping the other person at all, but rather they signed a prepared statement stating that they helped the other person, but they had been reassured that if the hidden camera exonerated them, which all the innocent people expected to happen, of course, then they would not get into any trouble by signing the statement. These innocent participants in the study were manipulated into believing that signing the confession would not result in any negative consequences. Now, in the federal case of U.S. versus Jocks, when discussing these studies, the court pointed out that, quote, obviously, these interrogations were not conducted by law enforcement, were not part of a criminal investigation, did not involve actual suspects, and did not present the students with a serious penalty. Consequently, Professor Hirsch, the false confession expert in this case that introduced the studies, readily admitted that these case studies have limited value, which in the context of this case is an understatement, the court said. Casson, one of the authors, has also said one needs to be cautious in generalizing from laboratory experiments. If this practice was actually used in a criminal case where a suspect was encouraged to sign a prepared confession, and we're told that if future evidence exonerates them, the confession will be destroyed or torn up or dismissed, it would clearly be a shock to the conscience and community, and such a confession would undoubtedly be ruled inadmissible. The premise espoused by false confession experts / social psychologists that lying to a suspect causes innocent people to confess is based on anecdotal cases in which, in almost all instances, the investigators engaged in coercive tactics, and is based on research that is based on a flawed premise and is inapplicable to real-life situations. So, as the United States Supreme Court stated over 50 years ago, misrepresenting evidence in an otherwise voluntary confession in and of itself will not render a confession inadmissible. The materiality of the misrepresentation should be evaluated by viewing the totality of circumstances. For additional information on the interrogation process and this issue of misrepresenting evidence, see our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions. You'll find information about the text on our website, Reid.com. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to listen to this presentation.